Swayam Prabha. Digital India. Educated India.
Hello and welcome to Gender and Society. This is the fourth lecture in the series of 20 lectures. This lecture will be on the historical and theoretical premises of gender. Over the last couple of lectures, you have seen that how we have talked about the biological conditions of the body and how we have unpacked the idea of the biological condition of the body as not really equal to the understanding of gender, that is the two concepts of the biological anatomical sex and gender are not really synonyms to each other. And we have also seen in the last lecture actually that gender is socially constructed. We have seen that what are the processes that go in informing gender as being socially constructed, and this is a process, the fluidity of gender is a process that we see not just in current times, not just in contemporary times, but also historically. And we have also seen that the idea of sexuality, the idea of sexual orientation is different from how we understand with regard to the anatomical condition versus gender. So this is the third concept that we talked about, that the sexual orientation of a person refers to the affinity of a person towards a specific gender, and the sexual orientation and our gender identity are separate. So there is distinct parts of our overall identity. So we have actually gone back and forth and talked about these concepts, and we have seen that how there are various social processes that actually take place to actually inform and influence these concepts. So with that, now we transition to asking a different question, a different set of questions that follow with gender as being socially constructed. So now we start asking, so whose gender are we talking about? So we have seen that gender is a category that evolves through time and space, but then even if we address to this time and space idea, the dynamics of time and space, whose gender are we really talking about? So we see that a scholarship has invested much to look at how gender evolves as a category of differentiation. So we have seen that gender can be and often is a category that is used for stratification, for differentiation. We have also seen that how is it possible that gender experiences are hardly only gender experiences. So somebody's gender experience is informed and intersects with other axes of differences, and we looked at some of the axes of differences that actually work along with gender, and some of these important axes of differences are the biological condition, the age of a person, race and ethnicity of a person, nationality, religion, education, marital status. So we have seen that given at a given point of time and space, how any one or some or maybe all of these actually interact with gender to produce a gendered experience, how we call it. So in this lecture, what we will see is gender's journey theoretically over time, and it is not possible to actually talk about the all of the theories that have informed gender over time, but I will introduce some of the basic theories and theorists over each lecture as and when they are relevant and as and when they are informing. And particularly here in this moment, we need to understand how gender actually intersects, how gender actually works with these other axes of differences. So, this is a framework, this is a theoretical framework that is popularly known as intersectionality, and we see that if you recall the history of gender's journey, conceptual journey, you will see that in the 1990s, scholars argued that gender is not a property of an individual, but is an emergent feature of social situations. So, gender relations are also processes involving power. So, it was since that time that we see that scholars have been arguing that it is not just a feature of social identity, not just an emergent feature of a person's identity, but is also a very important factor which involves power relationship, which actually informs a lot of power dynamics in society. The idea that the axis of identity that inform gender relations and how people relate to each other, such as with regard to race or ethnicity or age or class or religion or nationality, all of these. So, this approach to look at gender with regard to these axes of differences is called intersectionality studies. So, here we see that power, age, social status, ethnicity all structure out how gender related behaviors actually play out in society, and how they also vary in particular situations and historical periods. So, it is not enough to say that the gender experience of a person works along with these axes of differences, but it is also important for us to acknowledge that these are played out, these relationships are played out at particular situations, moments in history, and they actually evolve as experiences over time in society. The term intersectionality actually was coined and first used by Kimberly Crenshaw as a metaphor to explain how race oppression and gender oppression interact in African American women's lives. So, in this idea, Crenshaw actually put forward to pioneer the idea that it is not just gender which is at play, but it is also race in this case for African American women, which is informing the overall experience. And here you can see Crenshaw's one of the most significant works. If you want to take a look, please go and read up the article and to get a better idea of where intersectionality actually comes from originally. So, briefly to sum up, why did it arise? Why was there a need for intersectionality studies? So, we see that in the 1980s, it was from a correction to an early feminist assumption that ties that bind women to each other are stronger than the lines that divide them. So, you see that that point of time, that point in history actually was struggling, was actually negotiating with a lot of social events that also came with an assumption that all women go through the same experience. So, intersectionality comes as a correction to that assumption that ties that bind women to each other are stronger than the lines dividing them. So, there are differences amongst women as a category, and they should not be mistakenly thought as a homogeneous category, just like men should not be, you know, taken as a homogeneous category. So this comes with that in background, and the engagements with gender cannot be extracted from gender's intersections with race, ethnicity, sexuality, and beyond. So to talk about a person's gender experience, we need to understand the person's experience with the ideas of ethnicity, with race, with sexuality, with age, etc. So over time, what has happened is that the idea has become inextricably entwined with feminist epistemology and methodology, which is often used as an analytical tool on feminist research on family. So remember, much of these conversations actually come out from reorganization, restructuring within the family. So you know, people were more and more interested to look at how relationship within family and marriage were getting restructured as society evolved over time, and people were now paying more attention to ideas of household labor. So you know, these ideas actually gradually you know came into discussion, and you know, over time we see that intersectionality became you know very entwined with the methodology, the feminist methodology, the way of doing feminist research, and the feminist epistemology that you know informs a lot of these relationships. And we see that significant advances have been made in terms of talking about domestic intersectionality, which is often also called or known as methodological nationalism. So what happens you know to intersectional experiences you know within a nation state. However, we see that the scholarship that has significantly you know drawn our attention to the dynamics, the intersectional dynamics within the nation state, there is a tendency to limit analysis within the confines of the nation state until recently. So we see that there is another body of literature which comes from the transnational feminist sources, and they have actually documented the long legacies of colonialism and imperialism, and they have analyzed historically contingent factors affecting contemporary constellations of social relations as they map power relations, intersectionality, and across national divides and diverse gender. We see another body of literature that have come from the transnational feminist sources that have documented the long legacies of colonialism and imperialism. They analyzing historically contingent factors affecting contemporary constellations of social relations as they map power relations intersectionally across national divides and diverse gender regimes. And Grewal and Kaplan, to you know cite here, they have actually talked about you know these transnational you know efforts of feminists to actually you know document in some ways these very varied experiences. So they have paid attention to the linkages and travels of forms of representation as they intersect with movements of labor and capital in a multinational world. So with that we have an understanding that our experiences of race, class, gender, sexuality, they intersect to produce a social location of power. So remember, in the first lecture I introduced you to the idea that human beings have social locations, and here we are adding another factor here to the social location. We are adding a power dynamic. So the experience that we have with regard to you know the intersection of all of these axes, they actually produce a social location of power. Any individual within the social order experiences different forms of privilege and subordination depending on their race, class, gender, sexuality and nationality. So, your experiences are actually either privileged or subordinated by virtue of your intersectional social location. And because of these, because of each of these constructs is hierarchical, intersecting forms of domination produce both oppression and opportunity. So, we see these categories with these concepts, these differences as not just standalone categories, but they are also mutually informing each other, and they are also hierarchical. So, there is a power geometry, there is a power play that is at play here that can either give you intersecting forms of oppression or of opportunity. So, here you see that this is a one way you can conceptualize intersectional standpoints is if you can think of these axes as each of these circles that you see on the screen on the right hand side, that each of these circles, if you follow the legend, is an axis of difference. And I have included some of the important axes here, but this is by no means the exhaustive list. So, say for example, we have an intersection of gender, race or ethnicity, religion, social class or caste where it is prevalent, and nationality, then you see the red box here, that portion, this is conceptualizing intersectionality, this portion is going to give you a person's intersectional standpoint. So, this is one of the ways we can think intersectionality actually operates, intersectional experiences operate in society, is to look at the intersection of all of these axes, where they actually merge or where they actually intersect or where they actually mutually constitute. So, intersectionality is also a traveling concept, which means that over time this idea has evolved over time and space, and just like all socially constructed categories, the context of intersectionality matters. So, categories that are contextualized and have different meanings. So, particularly for gender here, we have seen that scholars have invested in contextualizing or understanding the ideas of race, the ideas of social class, to understand how the ideas, the concepts of gender actually can be understood in that time and space. So, not just the concept of intersectionality, but also various categories travel. They must be contextualized and analyzed in relation to the history of ideas as well as contemporary discourses and knowledge production. And as if you want to be familiar with this kind of work, I would encourage you to go look up the types of work that feminist scholar Mira Marx-Ferré does. So, remember we talked about how knowledge is produced and what are the politics, that politics of knowledge production that go on with understanding that the journey that a concept makes over time is also a politics of knowledge production. So, this is what the idea of intersectionality as a traveling concept is, that we need to put it in the context of time and space. So, here I want to introduce you to a theoretical framework. It's also an analytical framework, however you want to look at it, to understand in a way the journey of intersectionality across scales. So, this framework is called Gender Geographies of Power, and it was proposed by anthropologists Sarah Mahler and Patricia Pessar in 2001, and over the years the scholars have published on the idea of gender geographies of power, more popularly known as the GGP framework. So what does the framework say? So GGP is a framework for analyzing people's gendered social agency, corporal and cognitive, given their own initiative as well as their positioning within multiple hierarchies of power, operative within and across many terrains. The Gender Geographies of Power framework is intended to aid case and comparative study research and analysis of gender and its articulation with other socially constructed identities across transnational spaces. So what Pessar and Mahler are trying to do in this theoretical analytical framework is to understand, how can we understand the gender dynamics across a transnational space, across a space that goes beyond national boundaries, and what are some of the elements that we need to look at as part of this model. So what they propose is that GGP has some elements that constitute the framework. The first element is the idea of geographic scales. As you can see, that they talk about the scale starting from the body to the family, to the region, to the local, to the national, to the transnational. So they talk about these ideas of geographic scale starting from the individual, through the local, through the regional, to the national and to the transnational. And they talk about something called the social location. So I have been talking about social locations previously also. So they address the idea of social location here, that given a particular geographic scale, the social location of a person may be very different. And they also talk about power geometry, which other scholars have also explained as an idea of agency. So agency and the ability of a person to do something or to be actively taking part in something, so gives rise to a network which forms a power geometry between people and places. So they talk about this power geometry, and they talk about a fourth very interesting component, which is the imagination work. So people imagine some of these dynamics, and they actually act on those imaginations. So it actually reflects, the idea of imagination work actually reflects on several of these activities or processes that people take part in society, and therefore imagination work actually forms a very important concept or element for GGP. So GGP has been one of the earlier ways of understanding intersectionality in transnational space. So the elements of intersectionality across scales, if you have to analyze, if you have to start thinking through how you would be analyzing gender across these scales, one way to look at it is to first start by looking at the social unit. So where do you want to start your analysis from? Do you want to look at the individual? Do you want to look at spouses, couples? Do you want to look at families? Do you want to look at social groups? So what is it that a social unit, or the unit of analysis as it is also called, what is it that you want to look at? So once you have understood that this is pretty much what I want to look at, then the next step is to understand at what scale do you want to look at what geographic scale? So do you want to look at the process, locally or regionally or nationally, globally, transnationally? So what is the geographic scale that you want to look at? And the third component here is the idea of the intersectional standpoints, where you bring in the ideas of the axis that you think would be most important to inform gender relations. So do you want to look at gender? Do you, of course you want to look at gender, but do you want to look at race relations? Do you want to look at caste relations? Do you want to look at religion, language, education, etc.? So what is the intersectional standpoint or standpoints that you are interested in will inform your selection of the axis of differences in this element. So this is one way of understanding, analyzing intersectionality across scales. And when I say scales, I mean both geographic scales and social scales. So if we look at some of the recent works on intersectionality, and why is there a need to understand this concept, this this experience, intersectional experience, not just in a particular space at a particular time, but also why do we need to look at a transnational level? Why do we need to understand intersectionality better, with a broader aperture? So I want to read out a part of an article from Vandana Purakayastha, who is a sociologist, who has actually pointed out here that there is a need to recognize intersectional experiences at a transnational level. So I quote her: "Since the structures of exclusion and inclusion vary by country, there may not be a fit of social locations across countries. Instead, people may be relatively privileged and actively seek privilege in one country to balance the marginalization in another, as is evident in both cases. These simultaneous social locations are relevant for understanding intersectionality as a theoretical approach that is valid beyond Euro-America. Just as we recognize that fragmentation and contradictions mark social locations within nations, we need to recognize it at the transnational level." So here you see that Purakayastha actually talks about not just the need to look beyond the national scale, to look at it at a transnational scale, but also to look beyond an Euro-America model. So much of these theorization actually had started and probably has been pioneered from contexts that are maybe particular to the Euro-American contexts in the US, in Europe. But what happens is when we try to transport these theoretical frameworks, they may not fit into, say for example, a South Asian case or a Southeast Asian case, just as it would fit for an Euro-American case. So when this is one way of being alert with working with theories, and it holds true for gender theories also, that when you are in social sciences, when you're talking about social theories, they are produced at a particular time and space, and so when you're actually borrowing or when you're trying to apply a particular theoretical framework, you have to be careful that is it making meaning, is it applying to this condition, is it applying to this time and space. So this is one call that we see in intersectionality studies, that the concept, that the analysis needs to move beyond the national scale. I bring in another scholar's who is also a sociologist viewpoint, where she also talks about these importance of intersectionality to actually go beyond the boundaries of the nation state, and she says that much like the concept of patriarchy, applications of intersectionality also continue to be shaped by the geographies of colonial modernity. That is, the focus of intersectional analysis in general continues to be on the putative West, domestic and local, leaving unexamined cross-border dynamics processes beyond the local level of analysis that nevertheless are integral to the unfolding of local processes, especially processes over there. The paradigm of intersectionality then, in application if not conceptualization, falls short of its potential. So, you see that scholars are not just talking about the fact that intersectionality has not been used at a broader scale. They are also calling for a reconceptualization of the process, that how can we understand intersectionality better. So, just to remind you that we have been talking about here primarily in the Euro-American context, and with the regard to particularly with regard to race and ethnicity. So, we need to clarify here some of these concepts, such as the concept of race, the concept of social class, the concept of social stratification. So, to start with, how do we understand race? So, again, I want you to start thinking or in a notebook, start taking down or start noting what is your idea of race. So, assuming that you have noted down some of your ideas about what you understand to be race, let's now go through and see what we understand by race in social sciences. So, race refers to an externally imposed system of social categorization and stratification. So, it is a category, and it is a category that stratifies people in society. There is no true biological race that exists. For example, the connection between race and biology is questioned. Rather, human groups must be placed on a continuum. This is what current scholarship on race and ethnicity studies talk about. Race typically refers to some set of physical characteristics granted important by a society. So, oftentimes what happens is a biological attribute such as the color of the hair or eyes or pigmentification of the skin, they actually get social acceptance or do not get social acceptance based on the social arrangements. So, it is a physical characteristic of a person that is getting attributed by society as race mark. And race, just like gender, is a social construct. So, we see that over time race is an idea that has been constructed in human society, and the links of race with biology is not strong enough or convincing enough. So, here I want you to actually go to this website and take a look at this educational video that was put forward by the American Anthropological Association, that gives a very, very nice idea of how race becomes a social construct in a society that has gone through prolonged histories of colonialism or imperialism or migration. So, this video actually talks very nicely about how race becomes a social construct in the American society. And also please go to this website here that you see, understandingrace.org, where you can actually see this project by the American Anthropological Association that they take you through a virtual tour to educate you that how race becomes a social construct. So, please take your time and visit these two websites to get your ideas about race clarified. So, the two ideas, the two categories, that gender and race are shifting categories, that they are evolving categories, can be seen as classic examples in two census forms. So, the census of India, if you look at the 2011 census form, the gender categories on the Indian census form, you will see that for the first time a third category has been introduced on the census form. So, now there is male, there is female, and there is other. So, a person who is filling up this form as an Indian citizen actually has three categories to choose from. So, the person can either tick or at male, or tick at female, or tick at other. So, and this category of the other was only introduced in 2011, but it also shows a fact that even the biological condition of the body is not neatly divided into two categories. So, we need at least a third category, even if we cannot give a name to it, or we do not want to give a name to it, we at least call it something that is not male or female. So, the census form of India is a classic example that not just gender, but even biological condition can be socially interpretive, can be shifting over time, the idea that we assume for ourselves in society. So, that was an example to show how gender as a category evolves over time. And the other example in this regard, if you look at the census of the US, of the United States, you will see that the categories of race between 1790 and 2010 have shifted in the census form. And if you can follow this website, you can actually go and read it up what in details what happened. But here I have some of the screenshots from that website, that in the year of the first census 1790, the race question looked very different than it does today, and this is the US census form, and you see that there are four categories in the 1790 census form. You have free white males, you have free white females, all other free persons, and slaves. So, not just the categories, but see what could be or could have been the social arrangements when this was used in 1790. The second screenshot actually shows you that by the 1870s, these categories have changed. So, we now see that these race categories are now called white, black, mulatto, and Indian or Native Americans, as they are referred to. So, the same categories being reflected in the 1870 census. And in the 1890, you see that the that was a time where we see there was a lot of interracial intimacy in society, in the US society, and the race question was a huge question to address for the US society. And so, you see the reflection of addressing that question in the census form of 1890, where you have all of these categories of white, black, even for black you have 3/4 or more black blood, mulatto, quadroons, octoroons, Indian, Chinese, Japanese. So, you see the census form is a classic example, not just to show that race as an idea evolved over time, but it's also a classic idea that shows, that actually tells you what sort of social arrangements, what sort of changes in social arrangements actually took place around that time. So, when you have time, please go and take a look at this website, and please do some more research also to see how race and gender have evolved over time. So with that, we now transition to talking about social class, and this is this can be equated to socioeconomic class, but you have to be careful how you're using the concept. So social class is traditionally understood in terms of wealth, prestige, and power. The three components that you see here, that your tangible and intangible ways of negotiation in society. So wealth, prestige, and power are informing the idea of social class. And with that, hand in hand go the idea of social status, which is the position or rank of a person or group within the society. So we loosely use social class, to denote social status, but social status can be understood in one of these two ways. Is either you have achieved status, that is you have achieved something in society, and therefore you have acquired a particular status in society, or you have an ascribed status, which means that you have inherited a status that you have not necessarily achieved by yourself, but you have inherited from somewhere or someone. So social status can be understood from these two angles. Another idea that goes hand in hand with the idea of the social status and social class is the idea of class consciousness. So class consciousness is the perception that a class structure exists along with the feeling of shared identification with others in one's class. So in society, people assume that there's a feeling of shared identification, and there's an idea that you belong to a particular class, and you're conscious of that class, and you identify people who are with you in that class. So the idea that a class structure exists and one's identification with that class is actually informing and reinforming each other. And this also in a way informs the idea of social stratification, which is a relatively fixed hierarchical arrangement in society by which groups have different access to resources, power, and perceived social worth. So the reason you need to keep in mind that social class, stratification, class consciousness, social status exist is because they inform gender relations all the time, and the gender experience is often a product of the information from all of these categories. So now we come to an understanding that gender as a category, gender as a fluid category, has evolved as an analytical category. Let's see how. So what emerged in the 20th century was an absence in social theorizing from 18th to the early 20th century is an understanding that gender is fluid. So we see that in earlier scholarship gender was mistakenly described through biological sex as a variable, and then it only emerged in the late 20th century to talk about gender as an analytical category. The assumption of binary differences in early theorizing was what we see in scholarship that was produced around that time, and the woman question became mistakenly synonymous with gender. So we have seen a transition of the scholarship that was focusing on the women question, but then it was mistakenly becoming synonymous with the idea of gender, in that it assumed the male question, the question, the category of men in society as an assumed category. The constitutive element based on perceived differences. So are these differences that we are talking about, are they real or are they perceived, is a constant question that has been asked. And it also gender as an analytical category actually signifies relationships of power. And here it is helpful to look up how Pierre Bourdieu actually talks about the relationships of power through collective illusions constructing class and gender. So there is a very interesting way that Bourdieu talks about where class and gender actually interact, and that gives rise to class consciousness. So please do some reading on Pierre Bourdieu's work and how his work actually informs our understanding of class and gender. And then gender, the idea of gender as subjective fluid concept through time and space. We have seen that in the last few years we have seen a lot of significant works from scholars such as Gayatri Chakraborty Spivak, Mrinalini Sinha, Latamani Patra Chakraborty, Deepesh Chakraborty, Rachana Majumdar and Stoller, who have actually used and who have actually talked about gender in a subjective fluid manner, and also in a socio-historical context. So we have seen these scholars have given us some of the very important critical angles to look at gender as an analytical category, not just in current times but also socio-historically. So historically the dynamics that has happened to inform gender as an analytical category. So what do we find when we look at these historical analysis? So what do we find gender as? How did gender play out as a category of historical analysis? We see that there are two approaches to understanding this scholarship. One is gender as descriptive. That is, we talk about gender as existing at that time and place, but just describing that without interpreting. And then gender as causal. So we ask what we see and at that time, so why does it happen? So that how and why is something that we need to bring into conversation, bring into focus to understand how gender has been used as a historical category of analysis. So in this context, I want to read what Natalie Davis actually in 1976 said, that it seems to me that we should be interested in the history of both women and men, that we should not be working only on the subject of sex any more than an historian of class can focus entirely on peasants. So you see that there was a call to shift focus to understanding gender in society and not just women or not just men in society, and this is one way that Davis actually makes her call. And the next idea that we need to understand and analyze that gender and race as categories have evolved over time, and they have informed social structures, social arrangements, comes this is a classic example of how these arrangements took place. So I read from Oibumi's 97 work that the last 5 centuries described as the age of modernity have been defined by a number of historical processes, including the Atlantic slave trade and attendance institutions of slavery and European colonization of Africa, Asia and Latin America. The next idea that gender and race as categories have evolved over time, not just as fluid categories, but they have influenced social structures, they have influenced social relationships, social stratifications, come from a proposition forwarded by Oebumi in 97, and I read from that work that the last 5 centuries described as the age of modernity have been defined by a number of historical processes, including the Atlantic slave trade and attendant institutions of slavery and European colonization of Africa, Asia and Latin America. The idea of modernity evokes the development of capitalism and industrialization, as well as the establishment of nation states and the growth of region disparities in the world system. The period has witnessed a host of social and cultural transformations, and I've made it bold here just to show the significance. Significantly, gender and racial categories emerged during this epoch as two fundamental axes along which people were exploited and society stratified. So, we have some very important work that has been done in this context to show us that historically gender was used as a category of politics, as a category of social arrangement, as a category to inform social stratification. And one of the classic works in this respect, in the respect of South Asia, has been done by Mrinalini Sinha. Her book is called The Colonial Masculinity. So, over there Sinha actually shows us that empire building was represented as a masculine enterprise, and gendering of the space of the empire and the activities of the empire building as a masculine sphere was related to social and political problems in Europe. So, in Colonial Masculinity, Mrinalini Sinha actually points out that there was this larger politics at play, and gender was actually at the center of that political rearrangement or colonial political dynamic. And the idea that the making of the imperial race led to the restoration of manhood, and this was done through athletic activities, scouting movement, adventuring, and so on and so forth. So, there were actually deliberate attempts to put social negotiations around gender at play in the whole colonial masculine enterprise. And in this book actually she talks about Sinha actually talks about in Colonial Masculinity the dynamics between the masculine Englishmen and the effeminate Bengalis. That's from the title of the book. So, please go and take a look at this book. It's a very important work which talks about the use of gender as a historical category, particularly in the South Asian case. The second set of work that has been done in this regard to use gender as a historical analytical category was seen for example from Anne Stoller's work. The title of her book is Carnal Knowledge, where Stoller talks about how gender negotiations again lay at the center of colonial politics, and she takes us through a journey in that work where she talks about not just gender but also these cultural categories of being European in Europe versus being European in colonies. So, these categories of being European, of inclusion and exclusion into a category, that was also regulated through gendered and sexual regulations. And much of these negotiations of being European or being a native or being European in Europe or European in colonies actually was informed by the conjugal and domestic life of both colonizers and their subjects. So, this is another important work that I would recommend you to take a look. It's Anne Stoller's Carnal Knowledge. And in that work she also talks about the idea of concubinage and why at that time, at that colonial moment, was it an accepted form, an accepted social norm. And she also provides us with an answer that because it was the cheaper way of serving colonial interests of expansion. So, a practice that would otherwise will not find a social sanction, that would otherwise not be an accepted social norm, was actually accepted at that colonial moment because it was a cheaper way, it was an effective way to build an empire. And so, this something as questionable as that also came with the question of possession over children. So, we see that in Stoller's work she actually talks about the politics of possession over children over time, and she also talks about the ideas of social embeddedness of sexuality. So, what constitutes morality changes over time. So, how we understand what is socially moral and what is not, actually also shifts through time. And this is a classic example that Stoller uses in her work to show how that actually shifts. The third important work in this respect is forwarded by Rachana Majumdar, and she talks about marriage in colonial Bengal. The title of her book is Marriage and Modernity, and she talks about this is a context from the book. She talks between 1870 and 1956, there is a period stretching from the appearance of the first matrimonial advertisement in Calcutta, in a Calcutta periodical, and she gives us the idea that these ideas of succession, of ownership of property actually was revised over a time, and this was done through the modernization of families. And she actually puts forth an argument that we oftentimes think that the transition from an extended family to a nuclear family structure is probably the route to modernization, and also from negotiated marriage to marrying of individual choice is again the route to modernization. But she actually challenges that idea and shows us that that is not always true. So this is another very significant piece of work. It's by Rachana Majumdar, Marriage and Modernity, and she also talks about an idea of new patriarchy, where we see that there is a rearrangement of the patriarchal system in colonial Bengal at that point of time, and several gender roles within the family changed over time, giving rise to a new patriarchy. And it's a classic way for us to understand that even the idea of family can be fluid. So if you get a opportunity, please read her work, Rachana Majumdar, Marriage and Modernity. So with that, I want to conclude this lecture on understanding some of the historical contexts of how gender has been used as a category of analysis, and I want you to think through what intersectionalities with regard to gender, if race matters, if class matters, if ethnicity or sexuality matters, can you find, and what do they mean for you? So I want you to take a moment to understand what intersectionality is and how does intersectionality actually converse. It actually is in conversation with gender, with these axes of differences, and what meaning does it bring to you? So you can either think of yourself, your intersectional position, or you can think of somebody else's intersectional position if that's significant. So think through how intersectionality operates and why does it matter for us to talk about intersectionality. If you want to do some further readings, which I would highly encourage you to do, please take a look at Crenshaw's work on intersectionality, the classic work. You can read up Gender Geographies of Power by Mahler and Pesar, and you can read up Colonial Masculinity if you want to understand how historically masculinity as a gendered category was used for colonial politics. So with that, I will conclude here, and in the next lecture I will take up the ideas around women's movements. Thank you.